Hi students, this is Mrs. Moore on the subject of the American Revolution, and perhaps this will be our last lecture on the American Revolution, depending on how quickly we can get through things. As I mentioned to you, I have been going through this war more quickly than I have events in the past, getting into fewer details, which is tough because that's the problem with history. If you go into great depth, you could spend an entire year on the American Revolution. So if you happen to have your textbook at home, America, and you read the section on the American Revolution, that can fill in some of those smaller details if you're interested. I'm going to lecture today between my own notes, and I'm also going to be looking at your textbook as well. So if you have it, you can use it. I doubt many of you have the textbook at home because we weren't using it at the time that classes ended. We were using Frederick Douglass. But if you do, it would be useful to you. All right, I want to mention to some of you, if you're having trouble with these assignments that I'm giving you that go with the video, particularly just trouble remembering things that I have said, first of all, know that this is your recording. You own it. You can listen to it more than once. Secondly, know that it might be wise to... I think I'll just leave that in there. It adds some realism. I have allergies. So secondly, I wanted to let you know... Okay, realism, sneezing in real life. Secondly, I think what I wanted to say, it may be wise for you, if you have a printer, to print out the questions and be answering as you watch. If you don't have a printer, you can always write them down. What do I give you? Between 10, 15, 20 tops. They would be easy to write down, and then you can just go and transcribe your work onto the Google Doc or take a picture of it, whatever it is you're doing. All right, so let's wrap up this war. War is coming to an end. So in 1781, in the spring, British General Cornwallis gave up on capturing the Carolinas, and he's going to move north to Virginia. Pardon me. His goal is going to be to conquer Virginia and cut off American supply routes to the south. So here I want to turn to your textbook a little bit more explicitly and give you some more details here. Excuse me. Let's go back and talk about the Carolinas really quickly. All right. From the viewpoint of British goals, so what they want for their empire, the southern colonies were going to be more important than the northern ones because they produced valuable crops like tobacco, rice, indigo again, a blue dye. And so they really wanted to hold on to those colonies, in particular the British did. Eventually, the war in the Carolinas aroused ruthless passions and violence of a frontier civil war among neighbors that degenerated into savage guerrilla-style raids and reprisals between partisan patriots and local loyalists, along with the Cherokee natives allied with the British. And each side at times tortured, scalped, and executed prisoners. So here is where the war does turn pretty ugly and the tactics turn a little bit nasty. In one book I was looking at, I read that part of the reason that some of the loyalists began to join the Patriot side during the southern part of the war is because they saw that the British were behaving ruthlessly and in enlisting the natives to help them. And we see the people themselves, the Americans, are beginning to fight amongst each other. So let's see what this looks like. So General Cornwallis had Georgia and most of South Carolina under British control by 1780. But his two most ruthless cavalry officers, so on horseback, Sir Banastre Tarleton and Patrick Ferguson, who were in charge of mobilizing, training, and leading loyalist Minutemen, they overreached themselves. So there are going to be regiments within the British Army that are going to be made up of colonists who are loyalists, all right? But to overreach oneself You know the expression, your eyes are bigger than your stomach. You order too much at a restaurant and then you're full as a tick and you can't eat anymore. Your eyes were bigger than your stomach. So let's see how this applies to being a soldier, thinking maybe you can do more than you actually can with what you have. Excuse me. The British officers often let their men burn patriot farms, liberate slaves, and destroy livestock. So again, these are those dirty tactics I mentioned to you. As one of the British officers explained, "We've got a method that'll put an end to the rebellion in a short time," that's my accent, "by hanging every man that is found acting against us." Ferguson sealed his doom when he threatened to march over the Blue Ridge Mountains, hang the mostly Scots-Irish backcountry patriot leaders, and they called them barbarians, and destroy their farms. Okay, so what they're doing is going into the frontier, the back hills, and anyone who isn't going to go along with them, they're just executing and destroying their stuff. That is not, or possessions, livestock, homes, excuse me. I tell y'all not to use the word stuff, so I shouldn't either. So you can see that this doesn't seem to be a gentleman's war anymore. The idea that you just shoot someone who disagrees with you, who's not even engaging you in some sort of combat, that's ruthless. But all is fair in love and war, they say, right? Okay. Instead, the feisty over mountain men from southwestern Virginia and western and north South Carolina, including those from Tennessee, mostly hunters rather than soldiers, they went after Ferguson and his army of loyalists. So these mountain men, they were not going to be easily subdued. They clashed on partially wooded ground near Kings Mountain, just across the North Carolina border, 50 miles west of Charlotte. There, on October 7th, 1780, in a ferocious hour-long battle, the frontier sharpshooters decimated the Loyalists and Major Ferguson, their British commander, whose dead body was found riddled with 7 bullet holes. So we see how they completely underestimated the strength of these mountain men. Almost 700 Loyalists were captured, a dozen of whom were tried and hanged. This battle of Kings Mountain was the turning point of the war in the South. The British forces under General Cornwallis retreated into South Carolina and found it virtually impossible to recruit more Loyalists. I wonder why. By proving that the British were not invincible, the Battle of Kings Mountain emboldened farmers to join guerrilla bands under such colorful leaders as Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and Thomas Sumter, the Carolina Gamecock. So I believe I mentioned Francis Marion last time, the Swamp Fox, and those guerrilla tactics. So it looks more and more to even the Loyalists like the Americans are going to win, and it makes sense to join that side. In late 1780, and we're going to go into the Battle of Cowpens now. I mentioned a tad bit about that, I believe, last time, if I'm not mistaken. No, I am mistaken. Oh, no, I did, just briefly, but we're going to go into more detail here. Okay. In late 1780, Congress chose a new commander for the Southern Theater, General Nathaniel Greene, the fighting Quaker of Rhode Island. Now, do you see why it would be interesting or an oxymoron to call him a fighting Quaker? Because Quakers typically don't fight, but this fella did. A former blacksmith blessed with infinite patience, skilled at managing men and saving supplies, careful to avoid needless risks, he was Washington's ablest general and well suited to a prolonged war against the British forces. From Charlotte, North Carolina, where Greene arrived in December 1780, he moved his army eastward and sent General Daniel Morgan with about 700 men on a sweep to the west of Cornwallis's headquarters at Winnsboro, South Carolina, taking a position near Cowpens, a cow grazing area, that's why it's called Cowpens, in northern South Carolina. And again, I showed you last time the map and how it's, if this is South Carolina, it's sort of this top, I've got to go the other side, top corner here, okay. His force engaged Tarleton's British army on January 17, 1781. Once the battle was joined, Tarleton rushed his men forward, only to be ambushed by Morgan's cavalry. Tarleton escaped, but over 100 British were killed, and more than 700 were taken prisoner. Cowpens was the most complete tactical victory for the American side in the Revolution. It was one of the few times that Americans won a battle in which the two sides were evenly matched. When General Cornwallis learned of the American victory, he said the news broke my heart. And so I can show you a map here. And again, you can freeze this if you need to. Oops, there we go. And you can see North Carolina. You can also see how my manicure is failing. All right, there we go. Oops. Okay. So, after the victory at Cowpens, Morgan's army moved into North Carolina and linked up with General Greene's main force at Guilford Courthouse. Greene lured Cornwallis's army north and then attacked the Redcoats at Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781. The Americans inflicted such heavy losses that Cornwallis marched his men off toward Wilmington on the North Carolina coast to lick their wounds and take on supplies from British ships. So going to get more resources and licking your wounds. We know this is an expression that refers to animals when they're fighting, very often to try to heal up a bit. Greene then resolved to go back into South Carolina in the hope of drawing Cornwallis after him or forcing the British to give up the state. There he joined forces with local guerrilla bands. In a series of brilliant actions, the Americans kept narrowly losing battles while winning the war by prolonging it. It was a contest of endurance, and the Americans held the advantage in time, men, and supplies. They could outlast the British as long as they avoided a catastrophic defeat. So a contest of endurance. Let's see. We fight, get beaten, rise, and fight again, said Greene. By September 1781, the Americans had narrowed British control in the South to Charleston and Savannah. Although for more than a year longer, local patriots and loyalists slashed at each other in the backcountry, where there was nothing but murder and devastation in every quarter, Greene said. So again, understanding how communication is very slow, the people on the frontier are going to continue to fight without knowing how their main armies are going. So meanwhile, Cornwallis had pushed his British army north away from Greene, reasoning that Virginia must be eliminated. You have to go away now, Mary.
What did you do with your hair?
Okay, we'll talk about it later.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Reasoning that Virginia must be eliminated as a source of reinforcement and supplies before the Carolinas could be subdued. In May 1781, the British force marched into Virginia. There, since December 1780, the traitorous Benedict Arnold, now a British general, so you'll recall he led a lot of American victories, he had been engaged in a war of maneuver against the British forces. Arnold, until September 1780, had been the American commander at West Point, New York. But like many soldiers during the Revolution, Arnold had switched sides. So this wasn't unprecedented, what he did. Overweening in ambition, lacking in moral scruples, and a reckless spender on his fashionable wife, Arnold had nursed a grudge against George Washington over an official reprimand for his extravagances as commander of reoccupied Philadelphia. So history, as we know, is controlled by who tells the story. And one side may say that Arnold was actually rightly frustrated in being overlooked for promotions that perhaps he felt he deserved. But another side will tell the story that he was ambitious and dangerously ambitious. So it kind of depends on what you want to read. I always suggest, if you're really interested in a certain individual, that you read a story of that person's life written by someone who admires the person, and then one written by someone who's tearing the person up. The truth is going to be somewhere in there, but never really take anyone's solid word for these sorts of things. Everyone has a motive and a bias in telling a story in history. So, all right. Traitors have a price, and Arnold had found his. He had plotted to sell out the American garrison at West Point to the British, and he even suggested how they might seize Washington himself. Dang. Only the fortuitous capture of the British go-between, Major John Andre, had ended Arnold's plot. Warned that his plan had been discovered, Arnold had joined the British in New York City, while the Americans hung Andre as a spy. Okay, and so now we're going to get to this very final battle, known as Yorktown. So when Cornwallis linked up his army with Arnold's at Petersburg, Virginia, they had combined forces, again, these are the British, 7,200 men. As the Americans approached, Cornwallis picked Yorktown, Virginia, on the Chesapeake Bay as a defensible site on which to establish a base of operations. There appeared to be little reason to worry about a siege, since George Washington's mainland force seemed preoccupied with attacking New York, and the British Navy controlled American waters. Okay, so let's see. They're thinking about grabbing a particular city, thinking that their enemies focused somewhere else. To be sure, there was a small American navy, but it was no match for the British fleet. Yet American privateers distracted and wounded the massive British ships. Most celebrated were the exploits of Captain John Paul Jones, and I mentioned him a little bit in the last lecture as well. Off the English coast, on September 23, 1779, Jones and his crew won a desperate battle with a British frigate, which the Americans captured and occupied before their own ship sank. This was the occasion for Jones' stirring and oft-repeated response to a British demand for surrender. I have not yet begun to fight. Still, such heroic tactics were little more than a nuisance to the British. Think of an animal swatting a fly away. But at a critical point, thanks to the French Navy, the British Navy lost control of Chesapeake Bay. Indeed, it is impossible to imagine an American victory in the Revolution without the assistance of the French. As long as the British Navy maintained supremacy at sea, the Americans could not hope to win the war. For 3 years, George Washington had waited to get some strategic military benefit from the French alliance. In July 1780, the French had finally landed 6,000 soldiers at Newport, Rhode Island, which the British had given up to concentrate on the south, but the French army had sat there for a year, blockaded by the British fleet. Then in 1781, the elements for a combined Franco-American action suddenly fell into place. In May, as Cornwallis's army moved into Virginia, George Washington persuaded the commander of the French army in Rhode Island to join forces for an attack on the British army in New York. The two armies linked up in July, but before they could strike at New York, word came from the West Indies that Admiral François Joseph Paul de Grasse was bound for the Chesapeake Bay with his large French fleet and some 3,000 soldiers. This news led Washington to change his strategy. He immediately began moving his army south toward Yorktown. So remember that Cornwallis thought Washington would be distracted by attacking New York. But now he is moving toward Yorktown, which is where Cornwallis had picked to attack. Okay. Meanwhile, French ships slipped out of the British blockade at Newport, Rhode Island, and also headed south toward Chesapeake Bay. On August 30th, Admiral de Grasse's fleet reached Yorktown, and French troops landed to join the Americans confronting Cornwallis's army. On September 6th, the day after a British fleet appeared, de Grasse attacked and forced the British Navy to give up the effort to relieve Cornwallis. So if the backup or JV team for the British is their Navy in this event, monitoring the coastline, the French are taking the second the JV guy, whatever. I'm trying to use sports metaphors, and I shouldn't. I always try. I fail, but you get what I'm saying. The number 2 is being taken out. All right, so your backup plan, the British's backup plan just got destroyed by the French. So now Cornwallis's fate is sealed. Goodbye. De Grasse then sent ships up the Chesapeake to ferry down the Allied armies that were marching south, bringing the total American and French armies to more than 16,000 men, better than double the size of Cornwallis's besieged British army. So they had, roughly 7,000, you'll recall. The siege of Yorktown began on September 28th. On October 14th, 2 major British outposts fell to French and American attackers, the latter led by Washington's aide, your boy Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, New York, just you wait. Okay, what's your name, man? All right, I'll stop. A British counterattack failed to retake them. On October 17th, 1781, an abject Cornwallis sued for peace. To be abject is like, what are you gonna do? You got it, man. He sued for peace. And so remember, Burgoyne did some time ago, and now Cornwallis is surrendering as well. And on October 19th, the surrendering British force of more than 7,000 marched out as its band played a somber tune entitled "The World Turned Upside Down," because it was the underdog just won. Cornwallis himself claimed to be too ill to participate. He was eating ice cream, raw cookie dough in bed, don't you think? Binge watching Friends. Yeah, like a girl who just got dumped. I'm kidding. His dispatch to London was telling. I have had the mortification to inform your Excellency that I have been forced to surrender the troops under my command. I bet King George didn't like hearing that. So, what I would like to do, this is the end of the war, okay? And I think what I'll do is stop this lecture, and then the next lecture that we have together, the next conversation, I will go ahead and talk to you about the Treaty of Paris, terms of peace, larger effects of the war. I know some of that may have been a little bit tedious. There were a lot of details, but because lately I've had to give you such an overview, I wanted to give you something rich in detail. Unfortunately, as I said, if I were to give you that much detail for the entire war, we wouldn't get through it. I'm not sure how much time we have left together this year, but I would like to get to some other subjects as well. So I apologize for that. And again, anything you're really interested in, you have resources at your fingertips to look into more. And you can always let me know, and I can try to dust something up for you. So until next time, I wish you a toodaloo and take care of yourselves.